Oh, okay. Okay, let's get started. So week 2, session 2, creating a culture of obedience. This is the theme for the week. I'm going to try and keep this a little bit shorter even than last week so we can jump into the groups and get right into the discussion. This always has lots of questions and lots of practical kind of diving into it, and so I want to make sure we leave lots of time for that. But what do I mean by a culture of obedience? When I talk about a culture of obedience, the goal is that when you look at your family, when you look at your children, you would say generally they obey. Now, no child is perfect, no parent is perfect, so that means your kids are not going to obey every time, all the time perfectly. But generally, you want to have a culture in your house. The general way it works is that your kids obey. And there's an old saying that goes around. We got it from Resonate, and we've used it a lot since, so I feel like it's ours now too. But culture is what you allow. And this is such a big deal in parenting, is that if you allow behaviors to go unchecked, then that becomes the culture. If you allow disobedience to go unchecked, that becomes the culture of your home. If you let obedience and listening be part of the way your home is run, that becomes the culture. And every time you are interacting with your kids, you're making an inch to some culture, right? You're either making an inch to the good culture or you're making an inch to the bad culture. And what you really want to start being careful about is picking your battles well, so that when you are picking a battle, you're slowly inching to the good culture. And I do want to talk a little bit, maybe later today in this session or maybe when we're in the breakout groups, how important it is to pick your battles. Because you can't win every battle. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. You can't pick every fight. You can't take every battle. But every battle you take, you need to win. Let me rephrase that. You can't fight everything, right? So your kids are going to do things, and sometimes you need to let certain things slide. But if you choose to go after it, you need to go all the way and not lose. Okay, so we're going to talk more about that, what that looks like, because that's going to create the culture of obedience. Having a culture of obedience takes away the need for parenting tips and tricks. The idea that certain situations require certain tips or tricks or bribes or games to be able to get your kids to behave in a certain way. The idea of a culture of obedience is that the tip or the trick is that you ask them to do something and they do it most of the time. And of course, the question is this possible? If you have kids that are not in a culture of obedience, it may seem impossible, but yes, this is possible. The key is that it needs to be trained. And becoming obedient, just like anything else, a kid that's good at baseball has been trained in baseball. He's thrown the ball, he's hit the ball, he's done those things, he's played catch over and over and over. You can't get good at anything without some degree of training. So learning to be obedient is exactly the same. If you're not putting in the time of the practice, you're not going to have any culture of obedience in your house. So before we get into it anymore, let's stop and define what we mean by obedience. And this is something I stole, but I'm sure the people I stole it from someone else. So obedience is to not just do what I say, but to do what I say right away, all the way, and with a happy heart. I really like to say, do what I say right away, all the way, with a good attitude. But really, depending on the age of your kid, sometimes with a happy heart is just easier to understand. If you've got little kids that don't really understand the concept of having a good attitude, just say with a happy heart, and it just connects a lot better. But your kids need to start understanding this definition of obedience right from the start. Right as soon as they can understand these words, they need to be hearing them and being corrected when they're not following through with the full definition of obedience. Right? So what does this mean? Do what I say. This is the first and obvious part of what it means to obey. If you ask your child to do something, they need to do that thing, right? And there's kind of the technicality, and all of you have kids here or are about to have kids, and so you know that kids, even the little ones, like to go right up to the line and then cross it, but just a little bit, to see, A, if you're paying attention, and B, what you'll do if that boundary is tested. Anybody seen their kid do this exact thing? Even when they're super tiny, super tiny. You say, this is what I want you to do or not do. And they'll go right up to the edge of doing that thing, and then they'll barely do it, and then they'll look at you. And that's the moment you need to pick that battle. That's a battle you need to pick, and that's a battle you need to win. Because even if they cross the line a little bit, they know. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're testing you, right? And then when they do that side-eye look to see, like was saying, you can't let that's basically them picking the battle, right? So if they pick a battle, you have to engage it, and then you have to win. Because every time you lose a battle, they're just learning that, well, I can win against my parents, right? So when somebody says, I think I have in the book, like the example of, hey, I don't throw rocks don't throw rocks into the pond or whatever. And so your kid stops throwing rocks, but then they start kicking rocks into the pond. That's even kind of a technicality, right? And again, kids like to do this. They like to do the thing without technically doing the thing. And then when we get older, when they become teenagers, they say, well, technically, I didn't do such and such, right? Or like when you get kids and they start bickering, it's like, don't touch your sibling. And then they're like, not touching them, but they're right in their face, right? That's not obeying. That's not doing what you said, right? And so, of course, sometimes with littler kids, there needs to be training, but this is where you can come in as the parent and bring as much clarity to what you're trying to say as possible. The worst thing to say is, don't do that. Well, don't do what? Don't be annoying. Well, what do you mean? Like, a kid doesn't understand. Like, the more specificity you can give to the command, the more they're going to be able to understand what it is you're asking them to do. So on some level, to even have obedience in the first place requires some degree of clarity, right? So just on the most basic level, obedience means doing what you say, and not just technically, but actually the heart or spirit behind what you're saying. And kids are incredibly smart. They know what you mean. And if they genuinely don't, then you need to make sure you take the time to clarify, right? If they genuinely thought you literally meant don't throw rocks in the river, but kicking was okay, you say, hey, please, actually, I don't want any rocks going into the water. Please don't kick them either. Please don't kick them. Please don't hit them. Please don't throw them. Right now, you've made the line completely clear, and if any other rock goes in the water, you know they've crossed it. You know they've disobeyed. Okay? Right away, this means no back talking, no arguing, no just a second, Mom. No, let me do it one more time. You need to come to the car. It's time to leave the park. And they run up the slide really quick and go down one more time. Is that obeying? It's not obeying. It's cute, but it's wicked and evil. So it's really not cute at all. It's disobeying, right? So when you ask your child to do something, the expectation is that they obey right away. And the reality is you want the obedience for all the reasons we talked about last week. And a lot of times safety is in the picture, right? You need to not do that, and you need to not do it right now because there might be a car coming. Like, you need to stop right now, right? Or any number of other things, right? So right away, back talking, arguing, that's big, especially as kids start getting older and they want to get more of that independence. You're going to hear more of the back talking or the arguing or the trying to negotiate. And I think, again, as they get into even 10, 11, 12, you want to start teaching them the appropriate way to respectfully respond, right? So, hey, I need you to clean your room, Levin. Hey, actually, Dad, I was working on this other thing. Would it be all right if I spent 15 more minutes doing this and then cleaned my room? I think there's a certain degree that when you get to a certain age, now you're actually training into them an appropriate way to respond that's also respectful and asking. Now, for most of our kids in the 5 to 6, they're just not going to have that capacity to be able to rationally respond. It just needs to be obedience, right? And I think this is important. I'm going to throw it in here because I didn't really mention it last week. There's a popular kind of parenting technique that says you want to give your kids a lot of choices early on to give them the feeling of autonomy. I don't know totally the clinical psychology of this or what's totally right, but I think the more important lesson to teach them is obedience, right? So a lot of people will say, okay, your 5-year-old, don't tell them what to wear in the morning. Say, do you want to wear the red shirt or do you want to wear the yellow shirt? And then they get to pick between one of two things. Now they're having some independence, and you're avoiding the fight because they feel like they got to make the choice. what you're kind of subconsciously teaching them is that they're in charge, right? And that's actually not what you want to be teaching them. You need to be teaching them that you're in charge, right? Now, as they get older, right, in parenting, there has to be a degree of maturity, right? So at some point, you do want to give them the choice, right? A 3-year-old doesn't need the choice of a shirt unless it's a fun day or you're picking their dress for Sunday. Or I'm not saying strip them of all fun, but in general, again, don't use that as a tip or a trick to get your kids to obey. You see the difference? So it's like, my kid always fights me in the morning when I'm trying to get them dressed. But then I found out that if I give them some choice, it makes them feel like they're in charge. Now they don't fight me. Do you see the problem with that? They were fighting you. That was the problem. Now they just think they've won, and you've tricked them into thinking they've won. But eventually they're going to grow out of that, and they're going to fight you in a different way, and you're not going to be able to trick them with something so trivial. Right? So giving your kids choice for the sake of making them think that they're in charge or that they're winning is actually counterintuitive to what you're trying to accomplish. What you're trying to accomplish is that they would obey, right? So I don't want to give my kid choices until they've learned obedience. No, you're going to wear this shirt. You're going to wear the red shirt. And actually, once there is obedience established and you know you have that safety and you know they will respect the things that you ask of them, now actually you've created the space to actually give them the option. Would you like to wear the red shirt or would you like to wear the yellow shirt? Because now it's actually a maturing relationship rather than a power struggle, right? The power is clearly defined. The parents have the power. And as they grow in maturity, into their young teen years, like my son Levin, you're giving them more and more autonomy, more and more responsibility, more opportunities to respectfully negotiate, to respectfully push back. But again, it needs to be done in a certain way, not that's arguing, not that's back-talking, that's done respectfully. And I think this goes right into then, I can't tell you how many times I've seen just completely delayed young adults that have no ability to interact with their supervisors, whether it's Starbucks or Walmart or excavation companies or any other things. They've never learned that skill because they weren't taught at home, right? They weren't taught how to respectfully ask or disagree, right? And so we want to instill this in them. But in the youngest years, the most important thing is obedience. So do what I say right away, all the way. All the way. This means if you ask your child to pick up the toys, they need to pick up all the toys. If you ask them to come here, right, this is a big one I see a lot, they don't come all the way here. They'll take a few steps to you, and then maybe you get distracted, and you're like, they're over there anyway, right? If you ask them to come here, they need to come all the way here, right? They need to come all the way here, all the way. If you're not doing what you're asked all the way, it's not being obedient. And finally, with a happy heart, that is that attitude matters. And ultimately, we're not just trying to train robots. It's not Pavlov's dog, right? We're not trying to get our kids to respond to the sound of a bell. We're actually trying to form their hearts, right? We're actually trying to instill into them some degree of wanting to obey out of love and relationship, right? Knowing what's good for them and knowing what's good for you. And so attitude is huge. Attitude is huge. So this is our definition of obedience. Do what I say right away, all the way, with a happy heart. And I think kids can start learning that pretty young, surprisingly young. So how do we instill this? This is maybe some of the most practical tools that we'll get from this class, and I call it the 3 C's. The 3 C's are clarity, consequences, and consistency. So we're going to start with clarity. Clarity, I'm talking specifically on clear expectations. Again, just from what I've observed, this is probably the most missed mark of most parents is they don't tell their kids what they want from them, and then they get mad at their kids for not doing the thing that they wanted them to do. And I'll be super clear. If you don't tell your kid what you expect of them, it's really not their fault when they don't do what you want them to do, because they're kids and they're not mind readers and they don't know any different, right? So we have to train them and tell them what we expect, right? If we don't want the kids to run in church, we need to tell them, don't run in church because this is a fun place to run around, right? And there's other kids doing it. And we don't know the rules. Well, what is the rule? What is the rule for this church? What is the rule for your family, right? So if you don't tell your kids what the rule is, and then you get mad at them, that's not on the kid, that's on you as the parent, right? And this is a huge trigger of anxiety because kids that don't know what's going to set their parents off are going to get nervous and frustrated. Now, when you're thinking about clarity, you also need to understand about changing contexts, right? It's not okay to run in the church, but it is okay to run in the gym, right? So is running okay or not okay? Right? So this is part of growing up, right? So explaining to a child, hey, we're in church right now. We need to use our soft voice. We're at the park right now. It's okay to be loud, right? We are at our friend's house, and it's a formal dining room. We need to sit politely. We're at Matt's house. It's crazy. Let's have a good time, right? And it's no problem. Like, we're here to party, right? Fridge rights. So different contexts mean different expectations. And so in context switching, Jane was one that really turned me on to this. You have to explain to children when the context of the situation is changing, how does that change the rules, right? I'm at school, I behave differently than when I'm at church, than when I'm at the park, than when it's bedtime, right? Than when it's homeschooling time, than whatever, right? So as the context is changing, you have to explain the changes to the rules. And I want to interject right here. Your child is not too young to start understanding the rules. It's just they understand and pick these things up so much faster than you think. As soon as they start understanding any inkling of words, they can start understanding rules, right? And of course, it is, the older you get, the more sophisticated than rules can be, and that's just maturing in general. Obedience is a learned skill, just like anything else. We all have the urges. Like, this is what we call self-control, right? And some of us as adults have very little self-control as well, right? But you have to learn that. You have to learn that sometimes I want to do something, and it's not best for me to do it. And so you have to be taught self-control, which again comes back to obedience. So again, you can't just expect your child overnight to just get this, right? That you have to give them time to practice, and you have to think of it as training, right? What about a situation where they obey at school, but not at home? Or they obey for the Sunday school teacher, but not for you? What is causing this? It's a lot of things possibly, but possibly it's a lack of clarity. It's a lack of clarity because if at school they know the rules and it's perfectly clear what's okay and what's not okay, and they know the consequences of breaking said rules, then no problem. And if at home you don't know the rules, there's not clarity, and there's not clarity of consequences, then the child's going to be confused, right? So possibly if you're experiencing differences in context, it could be a lack of clarity, it could be a lack of consequences, or it could be a lack of consistency. It's also important when you're getting clarity to confirm that your child understands the rules. Right? This is a pretty easy thing to do. Some people will say, grab the child's hands, make sure they're looking at them, make them say it back to you, even just make sure there's a meeting of the minds, getting on their level, actually, crouching down, whatever you think is the thing, but you need to have some degree of confidence that your child understood what you were asking them to do. And this is really important because no parent wants to give their kid discipline when they're not really sure if they disobeyed. Right? So if you ask your kid to do something and then they don't do it, but you're like, well, did they understand what I meant? Right? She said, pick that up. And then you go back in there and it's like, not picked up. But then they did pick up something else that was by it. So maybe they thought you meant to pick that thing up, right? It's like, so how can you deliver a consequence, if they don't understand what was expected of them? Right? So it's very difficult to discipline a child if you don't have the clarity, one, of what was the rule or what was the obedience, and two, did the child understand it? So confirm that your child understands. The last big tip in the clarity is that sometimes if it's a difficult situation that your kid is learning, it doesn't hurt to give them the lines. Again, I learned this one from Jane. If you know your kid is going to struggle with something, you're not only creating clarity in the rule, you're going to give them perfect clarity in how they are to respond to the thing that you're asking them to do, right? So it's like your kid doesn't want to take a bath. You say, okay, Levin, it's bath time. I'm going to ask you to take a bath, and you're going to say, yes, Dad, and then you're going to stand up, and we're going to walk to the bathroom. You've just outlined the entire process. You've told them what you're going to tell them. You've told them how they're going to respond with their words, and you've told them how they're going to respond with their behavior. And then you've said, do you understand, Levin, what I'm expecting of you? Yes, Dad. Okay, now every piece is in place. You know with 100% certainty whether they're going to obey or disobey after you then execute line 1. Okay, it's time to take a bath. Oh, and then just go keep playing. Okay, you just clarified what you expected of them, right? And so that's not going to work. And so clarity is the first big step in creating a culture of obedience. If there's not clarity in your home, then there can be no obedience because nobody knows the rules. And ironically, sometimes the parents don't know the rules, right? Or sometimes there's not consistency between the parents. Dad lets them jump on the couch, mom doesn't let them jump on the couch, right? Or whatever the case may be. So have some clarity amongst yourselves as parents and amongst the kids so that everybody's on the same page of what's expected here. Consequences. Just like expectations need to be clear, consequences need to be as clear as possible, as often as possible. Now, sometimes it's not always possible, and consequences just need to be given to situations. But if possible, especially if you're changing contexts, right? Heading to church, heading to school, going to bed, taking a bath, heading to dinner, whatever the case is, you're changing context. Okay, this is the expectation for this context, and this is going to be the consequence if you go outside of these expectations. Again, look for response and demonstration of understanding from the child, that they would understand the consequence if they misbehave. And then deliver those consequences calmly and objectively. This is also extremely important. If you're flying off the handle emotionally as a parent in delivering the consequences, they're not going to be, the consequence is your frustration, not the actual consequence. And that's not helpful to the child, and it's not helpful to the situation, right? So if you can just clearly in your own head say, this is what I expect, and this is what's going to happen if you don't obey, you can deliver that consequence calmly and repeatedly as needed without getting frustrated. Now, I know that sometimes we get frustrated as parents. So the next line, I think, is probably, I would get some pushback even from my own wife, right? But I'm going to say it anyway. I think most of the time, if you're getting excessively frustrated with your child, you've waited too long to set expectations, to set consequences, and to deliver those consequences calmly first. If you've let the situation evolve to the point where you're getting frustrated and flying off the handle, you've waited too long. Most of the time. Sometimes it's just frustrating being a parent. We're all humans here. We're not robots, so I get it. So don't think, oh, I'm at home with the kids and I'm frustrated. Pastor Adam said it's my fault. Sometimes life is just frustrating. I get that. But if you set these things up, most of the time, your frustration means you skip some steps there. You skip some steps. We can talk about that more in the breakout sessions. Speaking of anger and frustration, that should never be the consequence. So you should never, and I've caught my own self saying this, if you do this, Levin, I'm going to be so mad. Like, don't make me mad. Don't make me fly off the handle at you, right? You're going to rue the day. That should not be the consequence, right? The threatening of your emotional instability should not be the consequence to your child, right? Try to make the consequences objective as possible. Now, I'm a big fan of spanking. I want to talk more about spanking probably in future weeks, especially for younger kids. But I will say this about spanking right out of the gate, that you should never, ever, ever spank angry. I think if you're spanking angry, that's not even discipline at that point, it's child abuse. And so if you can't control your emotions, you have to stop spanking, because I don't want any situations of abuse in the households, right? And so this is really serious. You can't spank your child angry. the old adage, this is going to hurt you more than it's going to hurt me, must be true about your spanking. This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. Did I say that backwards? Thanks, Matt. That old adage, like, right? I hate spanking my kids most of the time. I'm terrible. You're going to have to cut that out, Levin. It's true, right? We can get frustrated and we can want to you take out that anger on our kids, but that is not okay. That's abuse, right? And the world looks at that and then says, hey, no spanking. And then they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Spanking is an effective tool, but it has to be done correctly. And it has to be done in a way that's not you taking out your frustration on them, that's not making you feel better because now you've got the pound of flesh from them because you want to hurt them, right? It should always be, I hate it when my kid is physically in pain. It should always be something that's hard for you. But I'd rather my kid gets a spanking than end up in jail. I'd rather my kid gets a spanking than end up in hell, right? I'd rather my kid learn the lesson now while the consequences are low than later in life when the consequences can be dire and even life-threatening or life-destroying, right? So it should be a hard thing, okay? Now, again, if you're in a position where you're dealing with a ton of anger and you're spanking your kids all the time and it's out of anger, I would just stop altogether. In that case, I would just not do any spanking at all until you can get your own emotions under control. I'd use other forms of discipline because discipline should be done calmly. It also gives the child peace, right? It gives the child calm to know, I broke the rule, I got the consequence, and now we're reconciled, right? And my dad's not mad at me anymore. My mom's not flipping out, right? It's just, I did this thing. She said there was going to be a spanking. I hated the spanking, but then I got the spanking. Now it's done, right? And there's like reconciliation in that. This completes the circle, right? So it gives peace and understanding to the kids and to the situation, right? So I am a big fan of spanking, but it needs to be done well, and there's definitely wrong ways to do it, and I think we'll probably talk about it a little bit more next week even. I also think that the older kids get, the less effective spanking becomes. So the older kids get, the more you want to tie consequences to the actual thing that they did. So what we call natural consequences, right? If I said, hey, you need to stop playing, like stop messing around at the table, and they keep messing around, and then they spill a glass of milk and the glass breaks, and the milk's all over the place, they need to clean that up if they're 7 or 10, but probably not if they're 3, right? So sometimes all you can do is spank a child when there's really no way to tie something to natural consequences. But again, as they're maturing, you want to say, okay, as much as possible, I want to teach you that there's actual consequences to your behavior and tie those things together. So the last C is consistency. So we had clarity of expectations, consequences, and now consistency. This means that you need to keep the rules the same, first and foremost, unless, again, there's changing contexts. Okay, it's very hard for kids, just like if you're at work and your boss constantly is moving the goalpost, as we call it, right? That's extremely frustrating. And if you're a parent and you're constantly moving the goalpost on your kids, then they're going to be frustrated, they're going to be anxious, right? Keep the rules the same as much as possible and explain changing contexts. Follow through with consequences. This is one that I've struggled with a lot as well because I want to let my kids off. I want to be the nice dad. I don't want to be mean, right? It's not being mean. It's actually being mean to not follow through with your consequences, right? If you say you're going to do something, you need to do it. And some of you might be thinking, okay, well, what about grace? Grace, actually, again, it's grace to give them the consequence. It's not a gracious thing to let your child grow up in a life without consequences. So first and foremost, the consequence is the grace. God disciplines those he loves. There's your verse, Joey, right? God disciplines those he loves. We need to discipline our children because we love them, and actually discipline can be their grace. But again, once rules are established, once expectations are established, once consequences are consistently given out, now you actually have an opportunity, maybe for the first time, to actually teach your child something about grace. Because they've done this thing 3 times, and 3 times they got a spanking, now they do this thing, and you say, okay, what's the consequence of this thing that you did? You know, you hit your sister, and I told you if you hit your sister again, you're going to get a spanking. They said, a spanking. I'm sorry, Dad. And you see some genuine remorse and some genuine repentance. Now you can slip in a conversation about grace, and it will actually mean something. You say, you know what? I'm going to give you grace today. You deserve to have a spanking, but today I'm not going to give you a spanking. And they'll actually understand what those words mean and understand just a little bit of what kind of grace we can get from our Heavenly Father, right? So without having consistency, there's no way to give grace. A couple quick other thoughts on consistency. Never threaten unrealistic expectations. If you keep this up, you're going to have to walk home. If you keep this up, you know, I'm going to kill you, right? I mean, please don't say that anyway. But actually, if you do say that, don't follow through with that consequence. Right? But the big thing is, like, don't let your emotions fly off the handle and say things that you don't mean, because then it just makes you out to be a liar. And then you're teaching your kids that what you say doesn't really matter and the consequences aren't really real. Right? So don't say unrealistic consequences. Keep the standard for obedience consistent. And what I mean by this is, when you ask your child to do something, don't raise your voice. Ask them to do it once. Ask them to do it once calmly, and then deliver the consequence. If you ask them multiple times, you've just trained them. I don't have to listen to my parents the first time they ask me to do something. I have to listen to them the third time they ask me to do something. I don't have to listen to my dad the first time he asked me to do something. I have to listen to my dad when he yells the thing. I don't have to listen to my mom the first time she says something. I have to listen to her when she starts counting to 3, right? Any of those behaviors, don't ever count to 3. Don't ever count to 3. There's been plenty of times in my child's life where I think, like, the spanking has caught them off guard, right? I mean, it's literally like they weren't, because it's so calm, it's like they disobeyed, I stand up, walk over, boom. And then it's like, well, what happened? Like, I told you, if you did that again, you're going to be spanked. Like, there's no surprise here. I'm not mad. I just told you you're going to get a spanking if you do that again, right? And I'm not going to yell. I'm not going to ask you twice. That's what I said. That's what I did, right? If you want to have to yell for your kids to obey, I guess that's your consistency, right? But I'm pretty sure when you're in the grocery store, you don't want to have to yell at them, right? And now it's like, stop doing that. Stop pulling that off the shelf. And they're not listening because you're not yelling, because at home, they never have to listen until you start yelling at them. Right? So keep the standard of obedience consistent. And lastly, get on the same page with your spouse in terms of consistency. The more there can be consistency of rules and expectations, the easier it will be for your children. Last thing. There's a big question that got asked last week, and I love the question. And it's, if I'm in a situation and I'm totally overwhelmed with my child's behavior, where do I start? Where do I start? And I thought about that question a lot. And this is my best answer to that question. Start with obedience, but start with a specific type of obedience. Okay? And I came up with these terms with my wife this morning. We talked about this, and maybe there's going to be better terms, but for now, this is what we're calling it. Command-based obedience versus rule-based obedience. Okay? Command-based obedience is, I give an instruction or a direction right now in the moment, and I expect you to obey it. Rule-based obedience is more sophisticated, and kids need to grow into this, right? A rule-based obedience almost has future expectations attached to it, and it takes a lot of training, a lot of repeating, and a lot of rules and explaining of the rules. Rule-based obedience has to be gained incrementally, okay? And sometimes even rule-based obedience can be assumed on your child. Like, I may discipline my kids for acting a certain way, even though I never told them the expectation, because I expected them to know the expectation at that situation, right? This is like a matured version of obedience, the rule-based obedience. Okay, so examples. What's rule-based obedience? Manners. So it's like if your child is doing something that's rude, you may not want, like if your kids are out of control, you may not want to even start with disciplining at that point. Because that means, okay, did I ever explain to them manners? Did we ever practice manners? Did we ever set clarity on how they should behave in this situation? No, 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 no. Okay, then then it's not fair for me to discipline them on this situation, right? I can instruct them. Hey, please don't talk that way. That's kind of rude, right? But I can't discipline them, right? So there's always instruction, or maybe you just let that one slide. But what you can't let slide is if I ask my child to do something, they need to do it. That goes back to command-based obedience. And so if you're asking the question, if my household is crazy, my kids are out of control, they're hitting each other, there's a lot of things you want to work with: manners, whining, backtalking, sibling interactions, conduct when parents aren't around, all sorts of things, right? That could be hard about your parenting. You can almost wait on those things and start with command-based obedience. Does my child do the thing that I ask them to do when I ask them to do it? Don't even worry about the delayed version, because all those things will come, but they can't come until you get the first part down, which is command-based obedience. Right away, right now. Can I ask my child to sit on the couch quietly and read a book for 15 minutes? If I can't, I need to keep working on command-based obedience. Right? I need to be able to ask my child to do something, and they need to do it. You're not going to get anywhere with the rule-based obedience if you don't get first the command-based obedience. Is that helpful distinction? And we'll unpack that more in our groups, because again, I think if you feel way behind and your kid's behavior is just overwhelming to you, and you're like, I don't know where to start, this is where you start. And again, this is where you can pick your battles, because you don't have to command everything all the time, right? You can ask them to do something, and then that can be your battle, and that can be your thing, and make sure they do it and win that battle, right? So this is where I would start with command-based obedience, not all behaviors. I wouldn't address every issue. I would start with, do they do what I say? And once you get that kind of under your belt, then you can start expanding it into these more rule-based experiences where your child knows what to do without you even having to ask them, because they know the rule, versus I told you to do it. Does that make sense? Okay,